Okay. Well, it's time for part 5. We're gonna finish up Stave 3. So let's start. Okay. Then all the last part, you probably remember, the Cratchits ate their dinner. We just finished the dinner part. Now they're on to whatever happens next. I forgot 100% what happens. So let's go. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden galbets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all of the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Scrooge raised his head speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Miss Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dears," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such a odious, stingy, that'd be a bit different, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a shadow on the party, which was not spelled for a full 5 minutes. After it passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if he obtained, full 5 and 6 pence a week, with 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that building income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told him what kind of work she had to do, and how how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. At the time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge as the scene vanished to hear a hearty laugh. It was much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew. It is a fair, even-headed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, laughed out lustily. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself always. Here he takes into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been completely competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one not with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a very good one, and never swallow the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good for children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. There was first a game of blind man's buff, though, and I no more believe Topper was really blinded than I believe he had eyes in his boots, because the way in which he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. You couldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, and stood there, who would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an reply to affront to your understanding, and would instantly have set aloft in the direction of that plump sister. Here is a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something. Just need to clear my throat for a second. It's really hurting because I've been talking so much. Okay. Okay, there was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked around the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market and was not a horse or a donkey or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, the nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister cried out, "I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." Which it certainly was. Admiration was a sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Uncle Scrooge had predictably become so happy and light of heart that he would have drank to the unconscious company in an unaudible speech. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man, in his little brief authority, had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. Suddenly, as they stood together in an open place, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it no more. At the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom draped and hooded coming like a mist along the ground towards him. So that is the end of Stave 3. Tune in next time for, I'm guessing it's going to be, it's going to be probably 2 episodes for Stave 4. So I'll see you later.